Zakta Mishnah on Daf Tes Amid Aleph, that it's 9a. The Mishnah says as follows: Ein chayshishin shema gererag chulda mibayis labayis. We're not going to worry about that maybe a weasel came and grabbed some chametz and dragged it from house to house. Umi makim lemakim, or from one room in your house to another room in your house. We got to remember that the houses in those days mostly were dirt floors, one or two rooms by and large, very rarely two floors, and obviously much more open to rodents, etc., moving around within their houses. We don't realize how good we have it today. So once again, en chashin shema gerera chulda mi bayis mi labayis mi mokim lamakim. We're not going to worry about comets in its mouth and going from house to house or from place to place. The imkain, then you're going to have to start worrying about mechotze lechotze, from courtyard to courtyard, meaning from one house in the courtyard, it's going to run into another house in the courtyard. Or me'ir le'ir, we don't even have to worry about from town to town. It's just going to keep moving. In other words, says the Mishnah, ein ledover seif. If we're going to start worrying about an animal, a weasel, grabbing chametz and running from house to house, from room to room, we're gonna drive ourselves nuts. So he said, listen, that's not what we had in mind. Search your house and don't worry so much. Zok the Gemara. Tama delay chazinin deshokel. The reason why we're not concerned that a weasel is going to take the chametz is because we did not see the weasel take the chametz. Meaning, we don't have to make an assumption that some sort of animal is going to come and grab chametz and run around the house, and we got to keep worrying about it. But that's because we didn't see any animal, any weasel with chametz in its mouth running around. Ha chazinan the shakel. But in fact, if we had actually seen the weasel, with chametz in its mouth running into the house that had already been checked for chametz, that had already done bedikas chametz on the night of the 14th, and now after the fact, we see a weasel with chametz in its mouth running into the house. Now, chashinin, we've got to worry about it because now already we have an umdana. We've got a probability. That this chametz that's now deposited into our house by dint of the weasel running around with chametz, ubayi bedika, and therefore the house would require searching one more time, once again. So, freit the Gemara, va'amai, why? Nema achilise. Just because I see the weasel with the food in its mouth, why can't I just say simply, he took it into the house and he ate the chametz up? Why do I got to worry and say, oh, there must be leftover, he must have left the chametz in the house and we've got to do another search? Forget the other search. Let's make an assumption. That he went ahead and that he ate up the chametz, and I don't got to search again. Mi loitanan, did we not learn in a brisa? So the halach is as follows. We have a rule that if goyim live in a house, if the akum, oivdei avodah zarah, those who are idol worshippers, live in a house, the house is considered tameh. The reason why it's considered tameh is because, unfortunately, they had the propensity that if, heaven forbid, the lady of the house got pregnant and then had a stillborn, they would bury the stillborns in the house. And according to this mandiyama, even the goyim give off tumah on a mace, that even their dead give off tumah and make the whole house tumah, which would then be problematic for a Jew if a Jew would then subsequently live in the house. So the Gemara says like this, Mi loy tanan. Mid- Midoros ha'ovid kechavim, in the dwellings, in the houses of ovid kechavim, of those who are idol worshippers, temeim, they are considered tamei because unfortunately they bury their stillborn children in their own houses under the floor. And the Gemara asks, well, v'kama yisha b'madar v'yeheya modit tzarich bedika. Well, the question is like this: how long do they have to do these idol worshippers have to be living in this house in order for it to become problematic for a Jew if they leave and the Jew subsequently takes over this house? In other words, do they have to just live there one day and it already becomes problematic? Do they have to live there a year? And then we can make an assumption that there are stillborns in the house. And now that the Jew comes into the house, he has to do a bedika, the tzarech bedika. He has to do a search to see if there are any stillborns and to get rid of them. The Gemara says, aboyim yoim, 40 days. If the goyim are living in the house 40 days, then if the Jew moves in on the 41st day, he's got to do a complete bedika, he's got to do a complete search, because now we consider that there is a possibility that they had a stillborn and they buried the stillborn. This is even if the guy does not have a wife, because as Rashi points out, because they're chayshit for zinus, because the goyim are not exactly hung up on marriage, right? They got plenty of girlfriends, or as we know today, unfortunately, more than half of the babies born in the United States are born out of wedlock. They're not marriage is on the wane. If you allow for zinus, most people don't tie themselves up, as we've discussed before. So right now, so this is where we are in the Gemara, and the Gemara continues: the chol mokoim shechuldov v'chazir yecholim lahoylech, and any place in this house, if in this apartment weasels and pigs you go around all the time, are found there all the time, ain't tzarich bedika. Even after 40 days, you don't need a search if the Jew then moves into the house, because now we say the assumption is what? That the animals ate up the stillborn. So too regarding the chametz. Why are we worried about if I see the weasel carrying chametz into the house? I should just say, don't worry about it. The weasel probably went ahead and ate up the chametz, and I don't have to go back and go ahead and search the house once again. Okay, so that's the question of the Gemara. Now, before we go further, there's something else here going on. Once again, we said over here that when does a Jew have to be chayshid that there might be a stillborn in the house? If the goyim had been living in there, arboim yoim, 40 days. What is it about 40 days? It seems a very arbitrary number to say. What does 40 days mean? That means the guy and his girlfriend moved in, and on the first night, she became pregnant. And the Gemara is saying by the 40th day, she unfortunately had a miscarriage. She had a stillborn. And now we have to worry. What is this about 40 days? So if you look at Rashi, it's just a small Rashi, it's a little to the side. Mem yoim, 40 days. Kedei yitziras havalad. Because on day 40, the fetus is called a tziras havalad, has the form of a fetus. The halacha is, and it is found throughout Shas, that prior to 40 days, it's nothing but water. In halacha, prior to 40 days, it only has 40. In other words, according to Jewish law, life begins on day 40. Life begins on day 40. Not like the Catholics and all that, the life begins at conception. Actually, life begins on day 40. And the reason for this is twofold. The reason for this is because by day 40, mitosis has continued to the point where the heart is now beating, that the heart has been completely formed and the heart is now beating, which then means that the velad, the fetus, can feel pain. Feeling pain, if it can feel pain, it's human, it's alive. Zog Chazal, Zog the Torah Kedosha. On day 40, the fetus heart is beating. That's, as you know, that by about the 6th week, between the 5th and the 6th week, is when you can do a sonogram and you can hear the heart beating. Because on the 40th day, the heart beats. On the 40th day, the heart beats. It can feel pain. It can feel pain. That's human. Because the ability to feel pain is the ability to have empathy. And that's the definition of being a human being. The ability to understand and have empathy for your fellow human being and their pains. Which means that according to Jewish law, at the very least, abortion is possible up to day 40. Because up to day 40, it's not considered viable. It's not considered a tsuras havalad, which is the reason why the Gemara over here says aboyim yoim. Otherwise, there'd be no understanding. So the answer then is, when does this stillborn have the definition of being a human, of being alive, meaning in the sense that it can now give off tumah? Day 40. And this explains why the Jewish world does not get involved in the abortion culture rules, because we have a much more nuanced position in halacha about the whole subject. I thought you guys would find this very interesting. It's buried right there in those words, 40 days, and Rashi's words, Kedei Yitzir Sabalat. And it's all over Shas, in Brachis, and in other places it says that before 40 days, it only has a din of simply water. Now back to our question. Okay, v'chol mokim shechulda v'chazi yichodim lahoylech and tzarich bedika. Any place where the weasel and the chaza go around, so now there's an assumption that they eat everything up, including the stillborn. We don't have to do a bedika of their house, even if the goyim have lived in there more than 40 days. So the same thing should be by our case. We might have seen a weasel take chametz into a house that was already checked. Why do I have to recheck the house? Why can't I simply make the assumption that the weasel ate up the chametz? So Zot the Gemara, Reb Zeira loy kasha, ha bebasar, ha belechem. This is unfortunately with meat. This is with bread. Bebasa, obviously, bebasa, that means this flesh of the stillborn. Loy mishayre, they don't leave anything over. They eat it all up. It's like a pastrami sandwich. Belechem, with bread, mishayre, they leave over some. So therefore, since when I see bread that he took into the house, we've got to worry that the weasel left over some of the bread, and therefore I've got to go back and recheck the house. Amar Rava says, "Hi, my. Wait a minute. That's not a good enough teretz. Bishlema hasam. It's understandable over there regarding the adult by the guys, the adulterer's home. It's not. There's no certainty over there. Amer have, Amer loy have. Maybe she had a stillborn. Maybe she didn't have a stillborn. So number one, we have one uncertainty. Did she have a stillborn? Did she not have a stillborn? Uncertainty number two, if I'm going to say she had a stillborn, did the weasel and pig eat the stillborn or did they not? So in fact, we're dealing with two uncertainties, otherwise known as svek sveka. Uncertainty of an uncertainty. Did she have a stillborn? Did she not have a stillborn? And if she had a stillborn, Is the stillborn still here or has it been eaten up? A svek sveker loy goza rabbanon. On an uncertainty, on top of an uncertainty, the sages did not, what he called, put any gezeros at that point on it. That is a rule throughout Shas, it's a rule throughout the Talmud, that where I have a double uncertainty, the sages leave it alone and say we're not dealing with it. So over there, it's very simple. Once I have the second uncertainty, whether the animals ate or didn't eat, right? So that creates a second uncertainty. So over there, they said, you don't have to do a bedika. We could make an assumption that we could, even if you want to say there was a stillborn, we have an assumption that they ate it up. As the Gemara here says, maybe she had a stillborn, maybe she didn't have a stillborn. The imtim Sulaiman, if you want to say, or she did have a stillborn, she had a stillborn, maybe it was eaten up. So I've got a double uncertainty in the language of the Talmud, svek sveka, rabbanon ain't a geyser. They're not geyser. Aval hoch in our case, vadai de chazir and de shokel. One thing is we have an absolute fact of vadai that the weasel had chametz in its mouth and it went into the house. So one thing is sure, that there's chametz that was taken into the house by the mouth of the weasel. Mi yemed achilusai. But who said that the weasel, once it took it into the house, that it ate up the chametz? So what do we have here? We have a vadai, a certainty that the chametz was in the weasel's mouth and it went into the house. We have an uncertainty that once it was in the house, we have whether it was eaten or not. So we have a certainty against a uncertainty. Habi suffik vivadai. It's an uncertainty and a fact and a certainty. And obviously the ain suffik moitzi midei vadai. And an uncertainty does not take us out of the certainty. So the only thing I can rely on is the certainty that the weasel had food in its mouth and it took it into the house. That's the only thing I could rely on. I'm uncertain whether that once it was in the house, did it eat up the chametz? Therefore, I have no choice but to say that I've got to check the house again. Ain't suffik yaitzi b'dei. I got to check the house again. Excellent thing. So now the Gemara says, and that's why by chametz in the house, if I see the weasel with chametz in its mouth, it's different than the case of the stillborn, and I've got to go ahead and check it. So Zok the Gemara, is that a fact? Is that a hard rule? There ain't suffik moitzi midei vadai. That a suffix, an uncertainty, does not take us out of the certain status, out of the certain position. V'Tanya we learned, and we had this Gemara before, so just to remind everybody, a chaver is a pious person who always is diligent in doing every mitzvah exactly right. So now here's the case. We have a rule regarding produce. Produce has to, before it could be used, needs to be tithed. The truma needs to go to the kohen, the mice has to go to the Levi, and mice sheni needs to be taken off. When does it have to be tithed? When it reaches the level of tevel, when the produce gets labeled as tevel, it means it's tevel, meaning I am not allowed to use it because now we have to do the tithing before it's allowed to be used. But the rule is as follows. When does it reach the level of tevel that it now needs to be tithed? Only when it's gemar melacha, when its work has been done, meaning it has been completely processed. When it has been completely processed and is now ready, it is now ready to be eaten or ready to be sold in the marketplace. At that point, it takes on the name tevel. If it's before that, if it's still in the shaft, if it's still not processed, the truth is it does not yet reach the level. And the rule is it requires gemar ligma gemar malachtoi. Its work needs to be finished when at the point roya penei habayis. That's a pasuk in the Torah. Ra penei habayis. When it sees the face of the house, meaning when I'm bringing the produce into the house, into the storage house, at that point in time, it needs to be gemar malachta. It needs to have been fully processed, at which point it's elevated to the level of tevel, meaning at that point, I need to go ahead and tithe and take off the truma and maisa. Prior to that, if it gets to the face of the house and it's not processed, if it gets to the storehouse and it's not processed, it's still in its raw state, min ha-Torah, midioraisa, it has not reached the level of tevel, and you do not have to tithe. Which means min ha-Torah, you're actually allowed to use that, you're allowed to use that produce to feed your animals, and even you, if you're okay with eating unprocessed produce, unprocessed wheat, it's fine. Midrabanan, the rabbis went ahead and said, no, even on such a level, a person is not allowed to eat achilas keva. He's not allowed to turn it into a regular meal. He could use it as an achilas arai, as a snack, but he certainly could feed his animals. Okay? That's the overview of the Gemara that we're about to do. So back to the Gemara. But we asked the question, is it a hard fact that an uncertainty does not take us out of a certain position? But I'll show you that it does that does happen. Tanya, we learned, chover, a pious person, a person who's diligent in doing the mitzvahs all correctly, shemeis, that unfortunately passes away, v'haniach migura malaya peiros, who left over a storehouse full of produce, v'afilu hen b'nei yomin, even if the produce got there that day. So the produce got there that day, and on that same day, unfortunately, the chaver passed away. Im kol zeh, harei hen b'cheskas muskonim. We had considered that the produce is assumed to be b'chazaka, it is assumed to have been rectified, that it's been taken care of, that the chaver certainly went ahead and tithed the produce that came into his storage. So, Frank the Gemara, okay, even though he passed away today, we're going to have an assumption because he was a chaver, because he was so pious, there is no question in our mind. We take the assumption that when his produce today got to this storage house, he had enough time to take care of it. He did take care of it. And he actually tithed it, gave the truma to the kohen. He set aside the truma for the kohen and the maisa for the lady. Frank the Gemara, v'ahacha devadai tevile hani peri. 1 minute. Let's look at the situation. When the produce got to the storage house, there's one fact that's unarguable, at least at this moment in time, that the produce was at the level of tevel, that the produce had gotten to roy b'nei habayis, got to the face of the house, right? It got there, gemar malachton, its work was done. It got there, and it was tevel. That's a fact, because every produce first has to reach the level of tevel. So it first got to tevel. So that's the fact, that of course it had reached the level of tevel. The suffix ma'asrin, the suffix loy ma'asrin. But we are uncertain whether the chaver had enough time to go ahead and give meiser, whether he had time to tithe, to set aside for the kohen and the Levi. And what are we saying over here? Even though it's a fact, it's a given, that it was definitely tevel that needed to be tithed. And the uncertainty is whether he tithed or not. And we still say, b'cheskas muskanin, that we still say that we assume that he did tithe it, which means it means that the suffix, whether he had the time to give out the Trumas Maisris, he had time to tithe it, overrides the given fact that, of course, it was first Tevel. So you see, for the fact that Suffolk ain't Suffolk Yaitzi Midei Vadai is not a fast rule. The rule that it uncertainty doesn't take us out of a certainty is not a fast rule, because I see over here just the opposite. The certainty over here is that at the very least it was Tevel. The uncertainty is he may not have had time before he passed away to rectify it and to separate the tithing of Trumas Maisris, right? And yet we say, even though that's an uncertainty, we're going to rely, because he was a chaver, we're going to assume that he took care of the uncertainty, which means that the uncertainty overrides the fact that the vadai, the certainty that we know. So the Gemara, no, you got a mistake of the case. Hasam, in this case, by chaver, vadayu vadayu. It's a certainty and a certainty. It's a certainty that it got here as tevel, that it got to the door, to the face of the door as tevel. The vadai ma'asrei. But it's not that we have a chazaka, an assumption that the chaver had time to go ahead and tithe. It is a given fact that he definitely tithed. Rab Chanina Chazah, like what Rab Chanina Chazah said. The Omer Rab Chanina Chazah, because it says Rab Chanina Chazah, Chazaka al Chover, she'ein moitzi mitachas yodoi dover she'ein no mesukad. It's a chazaka on a chover that he does not take from under his hands, he doesn't release from his hands something that has not been rectified, which means that he made sure that as the tfuah, as the produce was being brought into the storage house, he didn't even let it get into the storage house, when at the moment he said, I am separating a portion for Truma for the Kohen, I'm separating a portion of Maisa for the Levi. And then it was brought in and put on the shelves and put away. So that means we're dealing with a vadai and a vadai. A vadai and a vadai, no problems. The Iba is saying just the opposite. Suffix for suffix. We're dealing actually with two suffix, two uncertainties. Dilma mi kara ema deloy tibli. Who said that this produce showed up at the door and it was already on the level of tevel? Maybe it got to the door, shaloi gomar malach. Maybe it got to the door and its work was not finished. It wasn't processed. If it wasn't processed, then it didn't reach the level of tevel, and it didn't even need to be tithed. Kidder Rab Oishia, the Omer Rab Oishia, Marim Odom al Tuvuasai. A person can be crafty with regard to produce. He can use his big thumb with the grubber finger, with the thumb, and he can go like this. He can be a smart aleck. He can go like this, and he can bring it in. He can bring it to Roya Pnei Habayis, to the face of the house. B'moitz, in its shaft, on process, b'moitz shalah, in its own shaft, kadesh tihei be'emta yecheles, which would allow him to feed it to his animals, and min ha'torah, even he could eat it if he likes unprocessed food, or midrabanan, at the very least, he could make a snack of it, but everybody agrees, even midrabanan, even rabbinically, that he could feed it to his animals, and upata min ha'maiser, and it's pata from tithing, because we said it only reaches the level to tithe only if it's been processed. So who said that it was processed? In other words, we're back to the case of two uncertainties. Number one, who said that when the produce got there, it was on the level of tevel? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was unprocessed. I don't know the facts of the case. So maybe it was unprocessed. Maybe it was processed. Maybe if it's unprocessed, it doesn't need to be, it's pata min ha'maisa. You're not required to tithe. Or maybe it was processed and you are required to tithe. And in Tim Suleiman, if you want to say that it needed to be tithe, it is tevel. Maybe the chaver had time to do the tithing, or maybe he did it. Therefore, we're dealing once again with an uncertainty and an uncertainty. Svek, sveika. Svek, sveika, like Gazer Rabbanon. an uncertainty, the Rabbanim do not make a prohibition. So therefore, that is the reason why we say we can take it on. We can assume that the chaver went ahead and tithed because we're not even sure that there was a need to be tithed. Either way, the food is good and it's not a problem. Something Gemara, okay, fine. The first two cases, I got another case for you. But you're still telling me that an uncertainty does not take me out of the certain position. But Tanya, we learned, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, it's a terrible story. There was a story with a slave woman who belonged to a meitzitz, an oppressor. Somebody who was an oppressor, was an abuser in the city of Remain. And Rashi says, unfortunately, Yisrael Hava, the last Rashi on the page. Yisrael Hava, this was a Jew. And unfortunately, this slave woman who now, remember, even as an Eved Kanani or a Shivcha Kananis, even a Goyish slave, once they become a slave of a Jew, they have the laws of Keisha. They have the laws, the same laws like a woman. Okay. In fact, after the Civil War, if you go down to Charleston, in Charleston, South Carolina, and the museum over there, you could actually see shtar shichros. In other words, at the end of the Civil War, the Jewish plantation owners had to give their slaves release papers, known as the shtar shichra, because they had a din min Torah, who had to keep the halachas like the women, like Jewish women, and when they were freed by Torah law, they become full-fledged Jews. So they had to have what's known, just like a woman, if she gets divorced, needs a get. There is a get by, there's a divorce papers, as it were, by a slave known as a shtar shikra, and there's actually in the museums in South Carolina copies of these shtar shikras. Anyways, it was a terrible story of this shivcha who belonged to this oppressor, terrible, and she got pregnant, and unfortunately she had a stillborn. She atila nafa labar. She threw her stillborn into the pit, into a bar. We are now on Tesamid base. Uba Kayin v'hitzabai, and the Kayin came and he leaned over the pit. So that was already problematic because if the stillborn is there, we said it gives off tumah. The idea, of course, is that this child is now a Jewish child because its father was Jewish, and the shivcha had a din of a Jewish woman. So the nafel, the stillborn, was giving off tumah, tumah's oil, meaning that the tumah rises up. So if the kohen leaned over the pit, it means that he leaned into the ear space of the pit, which means he leaned into the tumah that was coming out of the pit, the tumah's oil, which rises to the sky. So therefore, it's a good chance that the kohen just made himself tameh by leaning over the pit. Now, why was this kohen leaning over the pit? Liyadeya im zachahu im nekevahu, to see if the stillborn was a zachar, a boy or a girl. As we learned before a couple of days ago, if a woman has a baby boy, she's tameh for 7 days, and then she's clean for another 33 days, and then has to bring her sacrifices. If she has a girl, she's tameh for 14 days, 7 for herself, 7 for the baby girl, and then she's pure for 66 days, and that means from day 15 to day 80, and on day 81, she has to bring the kabbanas. So obviously, the kohen was coming to ascertain what were her responsibilities. Did she have, what kabbanas did she have to bring, and how long was she going to be tameh for? Okay, and yet what happened? He leaned over, causing himself problems because he probably became tameh because there was a stillborn in there, and there was tumas oil, and a kohen is not allowed to become tameh, and to see if the baby boy was a baby boy or baby girl, so to advise the woman what's her status, and they could not find the stillborn. The stillborn was not in the pit. So the story came to the Chachamim, and the first question, of course, was, what's the status of the kohen? Is he tameh? because he leaned over the pet. She threw in the stillborn. So there's Tameh in there. But when he looked in, he couldn't find the stillborn. Vitiharu. And the Chachamim said, don't worry, Kayin, you're still Tahar. No problem, you're still Tahar. Why? Because weasels and a bardalis, which is a polecat, or an odd terminology, a ferret, right, are found there. And what do? They go ahead and they drag away the carcasses into their lairs. So guess what? By the time you leaned over and you couldn't see the stillborn, right, the tumah had gone away. So frag the Gemara of wait a minute. Divada Yatila. One fact we know. She threw in the stillborn. So we know for a fact there was a stillborn in the pit. And that means there was tumah flowing out of the pit. So that's a fact. V'safik geruhu, v'safik loy geruhu, hai hashta. But we have an uncertainty whether the weasel and the ferret schlepped away the carcass or not. Just because the carcass wasn't there at that moment in time. So that means the one fact that we have is that she did throw it in. The uncertainty that we have is whether the stillborn was dragged away. What do you call was dragged away? Let me know, by the way, if we get cut off, because it said that my internet is not so great. Okay, so just let me know. And some girls over there, and yet what do we say? What are we saying over here? That the Chachamim still said that the kohen is tar. That we said, don't worry about it. The animals definitely dragged away the carcass. If that's a fact, it means the suffix position, the uncertain position, whether they dragged it away or not, overrides the vadai position, the certainty position that she threw the stillborn into the pit. So we see Vikasi suffix vadai, that an uncertainty overrides the given. Don't say that. You got this story all wrong. Don't say that she definitely threw a stillborn into the pit. She threw something into the pit. She may have thrown the stillborn into the pit, or it might have just been an air-filled ambiotic sac that she threw into the pit. I am not sure. And an ambiotic sac is only a din of water. So I'm not sure what she threw into the pit. So therefore, have a suffix, for the first time they're actually using the words. So now I've got two uncertainties. A, maybe she threw a stillborn into the pit. Maybe she didn't throw a stillborn into the pit. Maybe it was only the ambiotic sac. In Tim Salami, you want to say that she did throw the stillborn into the pit. Maybe the animals schlepped it away. Maybe the animals didn't slip it away. It's a svek seika. Svek seika like gozer rabbanon, and uncertainty. The Chazal do not geyser. They don't make a prohibition. Therefore, what did the Chachamim say? Koyin, you're tar. Don't worry, because the Koyin's chazaka is that he's tar. When he got to the pit, what was his position? Chazaka mi kara, it's called. Chazaka of where you're currently standing. The assumption of where he's standing is that he was tar. I want to take him out of his tar position into the Tomei position. I can't do that unless I'm very sure that the Tomei existed. Here I have two uncertainties. A, the Tomei may never have existed because it may never have been a stillborn. Get away from his chazaka mikara, from his assumption, his original assumption, which is, of course, that he is tar. So Zok Gemara, that's great. Okay, good, you got us out of a problem. Except the Brisa doesn't say that. The Brisa says, the Brisa says that the Kohen came to ascertain whether the stillborn is a Zachar and she's tummy for 7 days and brings a carbon 33 days later, or the stillborn was in a cave and she's tummy for 14 days and brings a carbon 81 days later. So that means the stillborn was definitely there. And for the Gemara, no. It's a two-step process. The Kohen first actually went to see, did she just throw in a sack, which is not tamei, or she actually threw in a real stillborn. The im tipsaloyman, if you want to say noifalapilo, that what do you call it? That she did throw in a stillborn, then to see whether it is a male or a female stillborn. So there was a two-step process. The Kohen didn't originally go there to see if it was a male or female. First, he wanted to go there to see, do we even have a problem that we need to discuss? The e-boy is sema, or you could have another way of looking at it. Hosam vadayu vadayu. You can say, no problem. She definitely threw in a stillborn. But not only is it definite that she threw in a stillborn, it's definite that the weasel and the ferret definitely schlepped it into its lair out of the bar. Since they're found there, vadai, it's a certainty the garo bahai shata. It's certain that by the time the Kohen came, they had already dragged it away into their lair. And the Gemara says, need the shari mishari, granted that the weasel or the ferret sometimes leave over some of the corpse, some of the basa, some of the flesh, which then means that it would still be tamei of a miga mias vadai gerurim shehi shata. But one certainty is there, that first they schlep it, they drag it out and put it into their lair. Then they start eating it in their lair, which is outside of the pit. If they left over some flesh in their lair, that doesn't affect the tumah that's no longer in the pit. Lishnach, there's another way of saying it, which is exactly the same thing. Granted, we can't say that they certainly ate them. We can certainly say that they dragged it away to their burrows. One more little Gemara. So right now we have a vadai and a vadai. So therefore, once I have a vadai, there was a stillborn, and vadai that they certainly dragged it into the lair, so the kohen could still be tahar. Zakti Gemara, back to our case about the case of chametz. How do we actually say, like our Mishnah said, if I don't see the weasel, we do not worry about. If I don't see the weasel, I don't worry about. I'm not going to drive myself crazy and say I got to worry about a weasel coming and taking chametz and dragging it into the house. So, but the next Mishnah is going to tell us after you do the bedikas chametz and you have chametz left over, for example, the 10 pieces of bread that you have to burn for the next day, right? So you put it on the side. You should put it into a secure place. Why secure? Why not simply on the counter? So that you should not need to search again. Because in other words, the Mishnah seems to be saying you need to worry that at night while you're sleeping, a weasel is going to come, grab one of the 10 pieces, and now you're not going to what he could. You're going to have a problem, and you're going to have to search again. But we just said in our Mishnah, we don't have to worry about that. We don't need to drive ourselves crazy. Amar Abayis says something very interesting. Loikash, it's not a question. In the next Mishnah, we're talking about already the 14th, Erev Pesach. Here in our Mishnah, we said you don't have to worry. We're talking on the 13th where he does Bedikas Chametz a day early because he's leaving town. So he does Bedikas here because he's catching a plane on the 14th. On the 13th, since there's plenty of chametz throughout the whole house, the weasel doesn't go and drag things away into its lair because it knows it can find food everywhere. Ba'arbas on the 14th, where of course all the chametz has been taken away and bread is not common in the house, and that's when he grabs whatever food he could and stores it away. On this, Amarava, is the weasel a prophetess? Yeah, the weasel really knows the difference between the 13th and the 14th. Yeah, it knows. It knows what's going on in the calendar. The Adina Arbesa, that it knows that today is the 14th Erev Pesach, and that we will not be baking and cooking anymore until the nighttime, until Yontif, so that it knows to leave over some food and to drag it into its lair and to hide it for its use. Really? Since when is the weasel so smart? Elo Amarava, Mashi yishayi yanichu b'tzina, whatever chametz is left over to eat afterwards. In other words, after you do the bedika, you should put in a private place. Shema tiltu chulda bifanenu, in front of us. In other words, maybe a brazen weasel will come, jump out, the women will go screaming and say, tell us to get rid of it. And in the meantime, the weasel will grab one of the pieces of the chametz and run away into the house. And then you'll need to do a bedika, even according to our Mishnah, which says that if you see, only if you don't see the weasel take the chametz, you don't have to worry. But if you see him take the chametz, then you do have to worry. Tanya Nami, Tanya Kabasa the Rava. And in fact, we have a brisa exactly like this. If somebody wants to eat chametz after the bedikas chametz, Ketzad also, what should he do? Whatever he leaves over to eat afterwards, he should put in a private place. So that the weasel should not come and take it in our presence, in front of us. Because if he takes it in front of us, now we've got to worry. Ramari says, the problem is that you got to put it in a secure place, because you will leave over, because what happened is you can leave over 10 pieces. From here, we see that the minig is to put out 10 pieces. You're going to collect your 10 pieces. When you do the bedika, you're going to put it on your counter, and in the morning, you're only going to find 9. And in that case, even if you didn't actually see the weasel take a piece, the bottom line is, the night before, your kids put out 10 pieces, you searched for 10 pieces and you found the 10 pieces and you put it into the bag, and now you're holding it to burn it the next day. And the next day you come back and you find that there's only 9 pieces in the bag. Now you have an assumption that obviously something happened, that a weasel or a mouse got hold of the bag and took one of the pieces, which means now the facts on the ground would then require you to have to make a search. So therefore, put the pieces in a cabinet where it cannot be found. Very good. We're up to the 2 dots.